Hey guys, Brian Schultz here with the Actually Tiny House Project, where we are exploring smart, simple, sustainable tiny house design and giving you some building tips along the way. Now, the topic of today's video is going to be how to install hardwood floors in a tiny house. But before I get into any of that, I just want to talk a little bit about some of the other flooring options that we considered, why we decided to go with hardwood, and why you might want to do something different. So in looking at all the options for what floor to put down in a tiny house, the two things that really stood out to us were natural plant-based linoleum flooring and also just a traditional hardwood floor. And the reason I like natural plant-based linoleum flooring is because it's relatively inexpensive, it's lightweight, it's really impervious to moisture, it's easy to install, and it's pretty good for the planet as well. And that satisfies almost everything that I want out of a floor, and none of the other options out there really had all of those advantages. Now, the reason we decided to go with a natural hardwood floor is just because we like how it looks, and for us, the extra time and money that goes into this kind of an installation was worth it to have that beautiful finished product. So traditional hardwood floors have upsides and downsides, but some of the downsides might actually be upsides as well. On the downside, hardwood floors are more expensive, but when you're talking about a space the size of a tiny house, a little bit more expensive still isn't that expensive, which is why we don't mind spending a little bit of extra money for really good, sustainably harvested hardwood flooring products. Now, the other downside is it's going to be heavier than putting down something like a linoleum or a vinyl or a cork floor. But when you're talking about adding extra weight to a tiny house, you really have to think of it in the context of the overall weight and where your key break points are on tow vehicle capacity and also on your trailer weight capacity. So in this particular tiny house, we were really meticulous to keep our exterior envelope as light as possible, because what we wanted to do was actually add extra thermal mass to the interior, because this is a tiny house that's going to be used off the grid sometimes, which means that without a continuous overnight heat source, you can get a pretty significant daytime-nighttime temperature flux, and having a little bit of extra thermal mass really helps to mitigate that problem. So those are some of the potential downsides of hardwood floors. Now let's talk about the upsides. And the first one of these is that, like I said before, they are absolutely beautiful, and that definitely influenced our decision for what flooring we were going to use. The other big upside is that they last a really long time, and this is one of my most important points when it comes to building materials of all types, because there's a tendency to consider just the initial embodied energy and the initial toxicity of any material as being its overall environmental friendliness, when really it's the service life of that material that matters even more. Because if you have one product that needs to be replaced 4 times as often as a different product, you have to multiply its initial embodied energy and its initial toxicity times 4. And so in the case of these hardwood floors, a good hardwood floor, well taken care of, is going to last over 100 years, which means that its overall life cycle, both energy and toxicity footprint, is actually quite low, which is, for us, one of the big reasons that we decided to go with solid hardwood floors. Let's go ahead and just talk about the flooring that we chose. What this is sustainably harvested big leaf maple flooring that we purchased from Xena Forest Products, which is a local sustainable hardwood mill here in the Willamette Valley. Now, when you're buying your flooring, you want to think about a couple of things. You want to make sure that you get a little bit extra, and that is usually about 5% for large house flooring installations. For small installations like this, I like to do about 10% extra because it gives me more choices if I want to not use some of the boards that came in the batch. Now, the other thing you need to think about is acclimatizing your wood to the average moisture and the average temperature of the living space it's going to be used in. Because if your wood is at a different moisture content than the living space it's going to be used in, and then you condition your space, what'll happen is that wood can expand or contract, and that's how you get warping and gapping and flexing and cracking and cupping, and none of those things are what you want to have happen on your brand new, beautiful, expensive hardwood flooring installation. So the way that we guard against this is by acclimatizing the wood, and you can bring the wood into your space and let it sit for a couple weeks, but that only works if your space is acclimatized the same way as you're going to actually be living in it later. And so what that means in the real world is you don't want to have this stuff sitting in your space if your building materials are fresh and they're giving off a bunch of moisture, or it's super hot outside, or it's super cold outside, or it's super humid or super dry. You really need things to be at a good average temperature and average relative humidity. And your friend for determining these things is going to be a moisture meter. You want to get yourself a good moisture meter. This is not optional, by the way. You want to make sure it's got fresh batteries and that it's well calibrated. And you're going to want to check a bunch of your different flooring boards and average the results. And you're going to want to check the moisture content of your subfloor and average the results of that as well. Because if there's a mismatch of more than 2% between your hardwood floor and your subfloor, now you can have problems with vapor transmission and also problems with expansion and contraction. So the average moisture content that we're looking for a new hardwood flooring install in a dry environment is going to be between 6 and 8%. And the average moisture content we're looking for in a more temperate climate is going to be somewhere between 8 and 10%. Now, this brings me to a really important point, and that is that if your tiny house is going to be unoccupied for significant periods of time and is allowed to normalize to the ambient moisture in a very humid environment, you could end up with serious buckling of your floors. So let's say you were in a humid state and you weren't going to be using your tiny house 3 months out of the year and you weren't going to be managing the climate control. That's not a good situation to put hardwood floors down, because these are just going to suck up that moisture. You're going to run into a lot of problems. All right, so that's the boards we chose, and that's a little bit about flooring in general. Now let's talk about just how to prepare the space here. All right, so first step here, I'm just going to double check the moisture in my subfloor and make sure that it is within 2 to 4% of the same moisture content of my wood here. And if that's true, then next thing I'm going to do is go around and sweep the space, clean everything up, and look for any nail heads that are proud, and just make sure everything's nice and flat. Next thing I'm going to do is go around and mark my floor joist locations on my walls here, because we're going to be rolling down some building paper, and then we're going to want to remark where our joists are on the floor. So when you go ahead and staple the flooring in, you can hit your joists with your staples. So next I'm going to go ahead and roll out my flooring paper here. You can see that I already notched this around the wheel well. And the point of your flooring paper is to act as a vapor barrier in case you get a whole bunch of moisture under your subfloor so it doesn't soak the wood floor. So I'm just going to go ahead and staple this down here. You don't have to put very many staples in, just a couple to hold it in place. Next thing I'm going to do is connect the line for the joist spacing on the wall across the flooring paper to the joist spacing on the plywood here. And this lets me know where I can fasten my flooring in. Generally, you want to hit your joists if you can. You also want to go in between them. So next thing I'm going to do is to create a line along the back wall that I can use to line up my first row of flooring so it stays nice and straight, because just like doing siding, your first row of flooring is to determine how straight the rest of your entire installation is. And if you have a problem there, it's not going to get better, it's actually going to get worse the more flooring you put in. So super important that that first run is straight. Now what flooring guys will do is they'll snap a line parallel to the back wall, because you can never trust that a wall is straight. But with a tiny house, we have a problem in that you've got a wheel well right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to snap my chalk line 3/8 of an inch in front of my wheel well to leave room for an expansion gap. And I'm also going to check that line to the opposite wall to make sure it's square to the whole building. All right, so here we are at the corner of the wheel well, and this is the chalk line that I just snapped that is 3/8 of an inch off the front of the wheel well and parallel to the opposite wall. Now, what you could do is just measure back from this chalk line to wherever it is and then start your hardwood flooring that way. But when you get to your wheel well here, that's going to require a really annoying custom cut around your wheel well. So what I'm going to do here is take a piece of my flooring and I'm going to line it up like this. So when the long piece of flooring comes in front of it like that, I'm not going to have to custom cut this. It's just going to be nice and straight and spaced appropriately away from the wheel well right there. So what I'm going to do is take this piece of flooring and then I can measure back like this to the wall and subtract my 3/8 of an inch expansion gap, and then I can go ahead and custom cut myself that first run of flooring, which is going to be way easier because I can just go ahead and rip this on my table saw to the right width. And what I'm going to end up with there is this, just like this. And then when this flooring comes in like that, it's going to be real easy to work around the wheel well. It's really important to leave expansion gaps of at least 3/8 of an inch. Some people do 1/2 an inch all the way around the perimeter of your hardwood floor. So next thing I'm going to do here, take this apart, and I'm going to measure back from this chalk line to where the tongue of this piece of hardwood is, and I'm going to use that to line up my first run. Now, just a quick word of advice here. An 8-foot straight edge is going to be super helpful for maintaining good straight alignment for your first course. I generally always have my 8-foot straight edge and my 4-foot straight edge handy when I'm doing this work. So when I'm choosing my boards for my first run here, I like to dig through the pile and find the ones that are as straight as possible and check them with a straight edge, because that's going to make it easier to have a nice straight first run. Now, once I know they're straight, I can go ahead and cut them to width on the table saw, bring them back here into the building, and I can set them right on that line that we made, that is whatever distance we figured out back from our chalk line. Now, another thing I do is I usually make myself a little block here with a little lip on it that I can use for my expansion gap spacing. Now, of course, you're not going to use this against the back wall because the back wall might change in dimension a little bit, but this is really helpful for the ends. The other thing this can do is you can just set it down on the line that's going to reference up to the tongue, and then just slide the board up to it, and that's going to give you a really precise reference. Now, do keep in mind though that sometimes tongues get damaged, so you can't use a damaged portion of tongue as your reference. Now, I'm going to do one final check here with my straight edge to make sure that this very first run is dead straight. Now we can go ahead and think about nailing it down. All right, so next thing I'm going to do here is use my 15 gauge finish nailer here to face nail about 3/4 of an inch from the back edge of this board. You want to be really careful, make sure it stays lined up, and you also want to dial this thing deep enough so your nail is going to be below the surface that's going to be sanded. And if you have any tall nails that you could see right at the surface, you want to go back and set those with a nail set. Now, most of the nailing we're going to be doing here is with a flooring stapler, which is a blind nailer, so you don't see the exposed fasteners. But for this very first run, we're going to do some face nailing that is going to end up being covered with the base shoe later. Now, unfortunately, my flooring nailer won't fit over this first tongue here because this wall gets in the way. So I'm just going to come in here with my finish nailer at an angle, and I'm going to blind nail this into the tongue. And I find this actually isn't very hard to do, but if you're having trouble making this work for you, or you're damaging the area or bending a lot of nails, you can always just go ahead and do a few face nails and then fill those in, and you won't even see them after you're done sanding. Now, the next tool we get to play with here is the pneumatic flooring stapler, and this is a super cool tool. It plugs into a compressor just like a regular nail gun, but how it works is you load staples into this channel right here, and then it fits right over the tongue of your flooring, and then it gets actuated by hitting it with this mallet back here, which drives a staple at a perfect angle down into your subfloor so you don't see any exposed fasteners when you're finished. And this is a super fun tool to use. You can use 1.5" or you can use 2" flooring staples. Nice thing about the 2" flooring staples is they can reach through your subfloor and get into your joists a little bit. The nice thing about the 1.5" staples is that if your plywood is sitting on top of your metal anywhere, you're not going to hit the metal underneath. But generally, it really doesn't matter much whether you're using 1.5" or 2" staples. All right, let's go ahead and put a piece of this in here. I'm going to take this piece, slide it in, and then you can take the back of this mallet. It's designed to hit the bottom of your tongue there without damaging your flooring. Go ahead and tighten that up. Make sure the ends are tight as well. And then you can come in here with your flooring stapler, set it right there, and you don't need to hit it really hard. It's definitely going to tighten up on its own. And then working my way sideways here, as kind of a general rule, you want to go every foot and you want to be on top of your joists if you can. So go ahead and put this right on top of my joist line, hit it, make sure I'm going in between, and then I'm going to do another one a couple inches from the end on the other end. All right, so now we come to the board that's going to go in front of the wheel well here, and because we did the careful planning on this, we don't have to do a weird cut on this. We can just slide this right into place. It fits perfectly. It's got an expansion gap already planned in behind it, and check this with a straight edge, make sure it's nice and straight, and then you can just go ahead and nail it off the same way you did your other first runs, by face nailing it along the back and then blind nailing it into the tongue along the front. Now, something you need to watch out for here while you're working through your floor is to make sure that you don't run out of staples, because even if this thing is empty, it'll make a dent in the side of the tongue here that looks almost exactly like a staple. So you want to make sure you're paying attention, and if it looks like your staples are getting low, put a new rack of staples in, because it always sucks when you get through a whole line of boards and then you get to the next board, you go to hit it, everything bounces apart, and you realize you haven't been stapling for an entire row. So make sure you keep an eye on your staples. So when you're sorting your material and you're working through your floor, it is super important to keep things random, because if you start kind of fussing with it and not liking a certain length or a different color or whatever, trying to make it look better, what's going to end up happening is you're going to end up making it look worse. The best way to just get a good randomized floor is to grab the next stick and put it in. Now, I do cut off any cracks that might be on the ends, and if I have any big open knots, I'll cut those as well, because I hate filling knots. But other than that, you're really going to get your best results just by grabbing the next stick, putting it in the floor. So once you work your way to where you're about 6 inches from the edge of your flooring paper, now it's time to roll out some new flooring paper. So I'm going to go ahead and roll out a fresh roll here. Make sure it's overlapping around 3 inches, and also you're going to want to notch it around any obstacles. And then you're just going to roll it out just like before, all the way down the building, and then you're going to want to mark for where your joists are, staple it down, and then you can keep flooring. All right, so now that I'm coming up to the bathroom here, I'm gonna have to start doing some custom cuts to notch around these obstacles. This is pretty straightforward, but keep in mind, it's always little custom cuts like this that tempts people to do really stupid things with power tools. And sometimes that can just give you a bad scare or a minor injury, but it can also be extremely serious. I have a good friend who recently cut his hand off trying to do a drop cut on a table saw onto a piece of flooring. Now, luckily they were able to reattach the hand. I didn't even know they could do that, and the nerves and the tendons and stuff are starting to grow back. But his hand is functional, but it is never gonna be the same. So make sure that whenever you're doing a little custom cut, you really take a moment to think and ask yourself, am I about to do something stupid? And if the answer is yes, find a different way to do it. So as you're working your way across the room here, you want to be really careful when you get close to the opposite wall, because it is super easy to accidentally hit your interior wall surface with one of these hammers. Now, the last couple boards here, you're not going to be able to use your pneumatic nailer because you're not going to have room to swing the hammer. So you're going to have to switch to either blind nailing or face nailing. And for your second to last board, you can actually carefully blind nail this through the tongue by hand. But for the last board, you're going to have to do some face nailing around the perimeter, just like we did on the opposite side. And so for me here, my second and last board are going to be hidden, so I just went ahead and face nailed both of them. Now, on your last couple boards, it's super important that when you're sorting your wood, you set aside really straight boards, because with the interior boards here, if they're a little bit curved, it's not a big deal because the force of hitting this tool usually straightens things out. But for the last couple boards where you're not going to have the leverage to really tighten those up, straight boards are going to help you avoid really bad gaps. So for your very last board here, it's important to remember to leave an expansion gap just like you did on the other side. And then there's two ways you can put this in. You can rip the bottom of the groove off on a table saw, and then the whole thing will just set in there nice and easily. What I prefer to do if I can do it is just to leave this intact and then just kind of work it in like this. And if you've got a good straight board, you can actually take a nice little pry bar here and just tighten this up like that. Now, this is plywood right here. If this was sheetrock, I would actually take a little 1/4 inch piece of plywood and put it in this area so I wasn't levering right against my sheetrock. And then after that, just go ahead and face nail it in, and then I'm done on this wall. All right, so that's pretty much it for putting down the hardwood floor in this tiny house here. The next steps from here are going to be sanding the floor and finishing the floor, but I'm not going to make videos about either of those things because I am not an expert floor sander or an expert floor finisher. And what you do from here really depends on the quality of your surface. If you've got a dead flat, dead smooth surface, you can get away with renting one of those big square sanders and just kind of gently sanding the whole thing. But if you got some bumps and some waves like what we have here, you're gonna have to cut into it with a drum sander. And I think really the best thing to do is just to hire a professional for a quick consult, have them take a look at things and recommend a sanding schedule. It can save you so much grief and frustration and the possibility of a bad outcome. Same thing applies to your floor finishes. Finishing hardwood floors is not necessarily as easy as it looks, and if you do it wrong, you can have a total finish disaster. So that's another thing you could talk to a professional about. I'll go ahead and make sure I put in the notes the sanding that we did for this floor and also the finishing we did, but do keep in mind that you may want to do something completely different. All right, so that's it for now. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. You can also find us at actuallytiny.com, where we've got a growing library of tiny house resources and more free tiny house videos. You can also find us on Instagram at actuallytiny, where we post a daily build blog of everything that we're doing here, including time-lapse videos including this flooring install right here. Okay, thanks for watching. Take care. Have fun building your tiny house.